I realized that I could reclaim my religion and culture by poking holes in it and make it mine in that way.
The cartoonist and author Liana Finck is here to talk about her new book, Let There Be Light, an adaptation of the Book of Genesis starring a female god.
One of my earliest memories, which happened whilst getting bullied, I thought, if someday I could make it so that someone else didn't have to go through this, then this right now would be worth it.
Jonathan Van Ness of Queer Eye fame will be here to talk about his new book, Love That Story. Plus, my colleagues and I will talk about what we've been reading. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's April 22nd. I'm John Williams. Liana Finck joins us now. She is a cartoonist and author whose books include Passing for Human, a graphic memoir, and Excuse Me, Cartoons, Complaints, and Notes to Self. She's a regular contributor to The New Yorker. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Book Review as well. And her new book is Let There Be Light, which is an adaptation of the Book of Genesis, starring a female god. Hi, Liana. Thanks for being here.
Hey, John. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start, before we get to this very creative book, talking about your own history with religious texts and some of what might have led you to this idea in the first place.
I am Jewish. I was raised conservative, which is a kind of Jew, and I went to Hebrew day schools. And so I was given like a pretty friendly and lovely form of religion, but I did not accept it. I've never felt religious. At the same time, I've never felt rebellious against religion. I've always really loved my religion, just had no desire to practice it, is my interpretation of how I felt. So this was kind of my way of just putting on paper how I feel about the Torah and God, just as this wonderful work of literature with a silly character in it.
So the silly character, I assume there are a few silly characters, I think, but the god at the center of it is somewhat silly. She's also well-intentioned. Describe her when we first meet her.
I based her a tiny bit on the character of Ponyo in the Miyazaki movie, this very powerful little girl who can work magic. And at the very beginning of this book, she's existing in a void and she just decides to make something. And it's all fun and games until she starts to feel some self-doubt and realize that she hasn't done well enough. So she's really kind of a self-portrait of me at that point. She's well-intentioned, she's happy, and she's very hard on herself. And she kind of has a big ego, and then she realizes she has a big ego, and then she hates herself for it.
As our reviewer puts it, you're about 3 panels into the book before she's having this crippling self-doubt about her creation.
Exactly.
And is that a sort of direct mirror of the artist in your mind?
It's me as an artist.
It's you in particular.
Yeah. It might be what it's like to be a female artist. I always feel like I relate so deeply to the ideal artist that I was fed as a kid, which is totally different from the ideal artist that people are fed now, I'm sure. But I was raised a bit on the 1950s idea of the male genius. So I relate to him in a lot of ways, and I totally don't relate to him in a lot of ways. Like, I think I'm all that the way he did. And I think I'm very special snowflake the way he did. But at the same time, I also just feel like a person in a lot of ways that made me feel unusual as an artist.
I wonder if also that notion of the 1950s male artist, I mean, how much did that tie into also what you saw as the image of God you were being given as a young person, as a kind of stern male figure? Was that always something that you imagined against in some way?
I just never understood it. I think it was wired inside of me that I should like God, as we're told to. And I just couldn't like that idea of God. So it just like fell off of me like water off of a duck's back. I wouldn't have put it into words until I started working on this book, but I never believed in a male God with a beard, even as a story character, even as the character that was intended in the Bible. I can't believe that's how God was envisioned by the writers.
You get the sense reading this book that you also are not someone who is, to use a phrase, like a confident atheist. I mean, there's definitely a sense of the love of creativity and also the love of maybe something beyond our understanding.
Yes, I think a confident atheist dislikes God And you have to believe in God a little bit in order to dislike her. It's just not in my bones to believe in God, but I love God.
Let's talk about some of the things that your God does early on. It trails the story that everyone knows at first, somewhat loyally. She creates a man, and what happens then, and how do you tweak the traditional story?
There are two stories of how God created the man and the woman in the Torah. The first story has her create them equal. She makes them out of mud, and there they are. And then mysteriously, the story starts over in the Torah, and it has God creating the man first and then creating the woman out of the man's rib. And this story was made sense of by rabbis much later by explaining that the first woman God created was a different woman named Lilith. And she was, quote, bad in that she had her own ideas about what she wanted and she didn't listen to the man all the time. So that was one of the few bits of rabbinical commentary that I added to my rendition of the Torah. The other one is something called Tzimtzum that's there to explain why God withdraws from the Torah and stops being much of a character in it. So I made Lilith into a character, and I drew her as the devil, which again is just my own inner mythology. I can't believe God is all powerful. I can't believe that the devil is bad. The devil in Judaism is kind of complicated. I'm not sure it really exists. It kind of exists. And so maybe my feelings about the devil are profoundly Jewish. I'm not sure. But I draw her as this kind of lithe Bugs Bunny character with little horns. And I went back and forth on whether to give her a tail. I ended up not giving her a tail. And she's this gender neutral character who just does her own thing. And she's a truth teller. And I relate to her as much as I relate to God. I think God is the child in me who's just very pleased with her own creations and very happy to make things. And then the minute other people see her creations, realizes that they're just little things made by a little girl. And then the devil is more of an adult, or Lilith is more of an adult version of me who notices hypocrisy all around her and is really annoyed by social etiquette that relies on people lying all the time. And she's just always out there telling the truth when it's not necessary or wanted.
She's also maybe a little bit of like the inner critic or self-editor telling you what it might hurt to hear sometimes.
Yeah.
You divide the book into the past, present, and future. And as you go along, it gets, I would say that if you're not terribly familiar still with the Old Testament, it can be hard to know what are flights of total fancy and what you're basing more on the actual story. How much do you, by the end of the book, how much are you untethered from the source text, or do you still feel like there's a through line and you're kind of telling the complete tale?
I was asked this question during my book launch, and I flubbed the answer, and I've thought about it since. And I'm going to say that I'm totally faithful to my vision of the Torah here. The one part that's a real departure is that, well, first of all, I edited a lot just to make the book not too long. And that I do feel guilty and complicated about. The part I don't feel complicated about is that I set the middle of the book of Genesis in the present tense and the last third of it in the future tense. And I draw the stories of Abraham and Isaac as if in the current day or a little maybe in the 90s. And then I draw Jacob and Joseph as if they take place in the future.
Was that just to keep things interesting for yourself to set in the future, or was there a thematic reason?
That's what I flubbed in the book launch. I thought, oh, maybe I did take some creative license. What I realized is that this is a work of graphic art. What do you call it? Of comics, not of writing. And you really can't hide your ignorance in comics. If I hadn't set these things in the present tense that I know and the future tense that I'm allowed to imagine, I would have had to do a ton of research and figured out what Abraham would have worn or else imagined it. And that's not my joy. I'm not a researcher.
Right. You're an imaginer.
Yeah. So it's easy to imagine God. I'm allowed to take creative license with what God looks like. I wouldn't have given myself the same license to figure out what kind of facial hair Abraham would have, what kind of footwear he would wear.
In the historical record. So I should
Yeah.
say for those it matters to that it's a mixture of irreverence and loyalty on some level. But there are obviously things that are very playful and clever in it. And I'm curious what you find funny about religion, in addition to inspiring and creative. And what were some of the things that you most enjoyed poking fun at in terms of tone?
I think that poking fun is my way of feeling close to things. I think that's also Lilith's way of feeling close to things. I didn't really fit in my community growing up, and it was a very small school and small synagogue, and I was shy and weird, and that I'm sure I wasn't, but I felt that I was the only one who was shy and weird and liked to draw, and that the community was all about just being, I don't know, being social and being uncomplicatedly observant and various things, nice things. But as I grew up, I realized that poking holes in things was also a way that you can be, and that you could make human connections by doing that. And that's what my career is as a cartoonist. So I realized that I could reclaim my religion and culture by poking holes in it and make it mine in that way.
And so given that you've written this full-length book now about it and illustrated it, do you feel like you've reached some different space in that part of your life? How has your family reacted to it? Has it opened up conversations about those things?
The part of my family that's read it is the part that totally gets it and likes it. I think, although it's still I think it's always hard to tell your parents that you didn't like school or something. I think that makes them feel bad, but they like it. And I really feel like I got God through this book. It's weird. And I'm a very slow worker in a certain way, in that I rework and rework and rework. So I reread the Torah so many times while I was working on this book, and I don't go to synagogue, and I feel bad about it. So I don't get to interface with the Torah or the prayers very much. And I don't just pick it up and read it on my own. I'm not that kind of person. I'm too busy. So it was just such a meaningful way to get to read the stories again. And I miss it. I have the book of Exodus queued up on my Audible, and I'm going to read it next.
Do you have the book of Exodus or anything else queued up, creatively speaking? Did this create an itch that you think you'll scratch again, or is this it?
I just sold a book to the same editor and publisher that's about the Lilith character. I might rename her, but she's kind of the devil, and it's a story about relationships. It's kind of a mashup of that character and delving into what it's like to be in a marriage. She's married to an angel.
The great joys of this book are visual. I'm thinking in particular of the moment when Eve bites the apple. There's this incredibly funny and clever page where there's kind of a flow chart of all ideas coursing through her. And so I encourage people to pick it up and look at it for themselves. But thank you so much for being here to talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's Liana Finck. And again, her new book is Let There Be Light.
My name is Lauren Christensen. I am a senior staff editor at the New York Times Book Review, and I am here with Jonathan Van Ness, who's the author most recently of Love That Story, an essay collection. He was previously the author of a memoir called Over the Top, and many listeners may know him as a star and the grooming expert on Netflix's Queer Eye. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. It's really, really exciting to be able to talk to you today. I was so moved by your first book, Over the Top, obviously for its social impact, helping to destigmatize sex work and sexual abuse and a positive HIV diagnosis. But what I think can't be stated enough is what a gifted storyteller you obviously are. So thank you. Thank you for joining us.
That was really kind. Thank you for saying that.
You know, I think some of our listeners might know you as a co-star on Netflix's Queer Eye, but I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you came to writing and how this publishing experience has been for you so far.
English and writing was definitely my favorite subject growing up, and I think writing as a means of expressing myself is something that I've done off and on through my whole life. So this like pull to want to express myself through writing and creative writing has been something that's been present for me, but it was never something that I thought was a viable way for me to like do for a living. And so then obviously I got into entertainment. My first kind of foray into entertainment was Game of Thrones. And that was my first experience of, after years of working in Game of Thrones, starting to realize like, oh, I can write things and I can be funny on cue. And then once I booked Queer Eye, I really started having more things to talk about and more things to think about. And then I was like, oh my God, I could be a writer. And so that was kind of how Over the Top started. One of my earliest memories, which happened whilst getting bullied, I thought, if someday I could make it so that someone else didn't have to go through this, then this right now would be worth it. And I think that really culminated in Over the Top. And it's something that I think about in both of my first two adult books. Even with Peanut Goes for the Gold, a little bit. I wanted, it's like starting young. For me, writing, it feels like this urge to distill information and distill things that I've learned in an effort to try to help people.
I mean, it's so interesting to hear you talk about getting into writing through the comedy and entertainment worlds. And one of the essays, you talk about your stand-up comedy, and there's a passage where you're discussing the difference between when you had a set really ironed out and how the performance was actually stiffer than when you just kind of riffed on certain things. So I'm curious, when you're writing these essays, was it just kind of a free flow? Were you constantly self-editing as you were writing, or did you just kind of like spill it all out?
It's kind of both. After Over the Top came out, and it reminds me of just like learning how to do anything, except for like if when you started to learn to write books and write a memoir, you were like, oh my God, I kind of miss it, which was surprising because parts of it felt like putting my soul in a blender, like getting my teeth pulled. But then I missed writing, and I had all of these new experiences from Over the Top coming out, from meeting who is my now husband, and just a lot of experiences that I just went back to that medium of wanting to write. And then I think it was right around when everything shut down, I was like, there are so many more things that I want to write about and more things that I want to do. And I realized that I had another story to tell, or more stories to tell in this case. And that was kind of how Love That Story happened. But it was really spilling everything out, not realizing that it was going to be for a book. It was just because like writing was something that therapists suggest for me forever. So I've been doing it since I was, 7, like off and on, just like writing everything down that I'm thinking and then just like letting it go, just as a means of like getting it out. So I came back to that, except for I didn't throw them away and didn't let them go. And then it was about refining and making sure that I'm not telling stories in circles, which I do that sometimes. and so it was like starting by just spilling it all out and then refining and editing and taking out every single nervous honey that I write. I also found I kept wanting to say deeply this, deeply that. Like so it's always like editing and like finding different words and different ways of saying things and making sure that I'm not being precious with my words for the sake of it, but rather that it works better that way. It's like painting or drawing. I'm always editing because it's art. Storytelling and writing it's art.
So did you write these all in one go, or are these collected from years of writing for catharsis?
They're all from when Over the Top came out. So it's all post that. And that's really where the first essay comes into focus, is what was happening, what the experience was like of writing Over the Top, what happened in the immediate aftermath. And then it picks up from there.
In that essay, you write about some of the responses that you got to Over the Top from the media, from the public, and responses that you felt maybe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but distorted the meaning you were trying to get across in some way. I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
I mean, writing Over the Top whilst being on Queer Eye and maintaining my podcast and doing everything else and adjusting to this new public life, and then realizing what the stakes were with what I wanted to include in Over the Top, and that I was going to stay that course and talk about my HIV status and talk about my trauma. And it required me to be so present, and it was such a heavy lift that I guess I just didn't really even know what to expect when the book came out, to the point that, it didn't occur to me that when I would do press for the book, that press would come out before the book would. And that I remember like yesterday, everything was just so new to me. But I just felt that there was so much sensationalizing around my HIV status, and this need to focus so much of the coverage on the big, quote, bigger, shocking revelations. It didn't give a full picture of what Over the Top was, which it is funny and it is light and it is about connection and it's about your relationship with yourself, and it's about the other really difficult things that we do talk about, like surviving sexual abuse and trauma and an HIV positive diagnosis. But it was also more than that. And I just felt like that didn't come across in so many times. And I found myself having to just be this. It's just like I mentioned in that part. It's like I thought that writing it was going to be the hardest part. And I think by like the 755th millionth time that I was explaining what undetectable equals untransmittable is, and having to say, like, that's not how you would ask someone that question. And not that that happened in interviews necessarily, but there was a lot of really difficult conversations that I needed to have with all sorts of people, that just relearning how to have boundaries. And that's difficult when you're in that position. And I don't think I really realized that until after the book came out.
That really makes me wonder if writing this book, which does reach far, far beyond your own personal experience. I mean, Over at the Top did it too in some ways, but I think in this collection of essays, you really cross out of memoir into journalism, and there's self-help, there's political activism. It's obviously still so clearly your signature voice throughout, but did it feel, I don't want to say more or less of a challenge because that's so simplistic, but how was the challenge different here when you were writing about things that were maybe an arm's length away from your particular experiences?
I think that hosting Getting Curious, the podcast, for these years, and having like 200 something interviews, I'm sure around the point when I started writing this book, or like 190 something, prepared me to be ready to attempt to write about things that were farther from my experience, and try to distill some of the experiences that I've had and the ways that they do relate to some of these subjects, and do it in a way that is respectful and do it in a way that is curious. But it's like, but even so, whether we're talking about the HIV social safety net, I have a different relationship to that experience, even though I'm also talking about other people's experiences that are very far away from mine in terms of gender, race, privilege. So even though I'm talking about like wider things that, as you say, like an arm's distance apart, I'm still always trying to be curious about them and share the information about them from the experience that I've lived, or share someone else's experience and knowledge, because there's a lot of interviews and a lot of research that went into this book. And so I tried to be very clear about what experience is mine, what experience is theirs, and how are we connected, and what is the takeaway from that experience.
That definitely comes across. I mean, your very personal connection to these issues that then inspires you to go out and research more. And there's a lot of independent reporting in this book, in Love That Story, and talking to experts on like the HIV safety net, for example, or when you go back to your hometown of Quincy, Illinois, to this drag bar that you never went to as a kid and only went to later as an adult, and on imposter syndrome, systemic racism. There's a transphobia essay about being disillusioned with J.K. Rowling. I mean, there's, as I said, a lot of reporting. Do you see yourself as moving into the fields of political activism or even reporting going forward?
I have a dear friend named Alok who was on an episode of Getting Curious on Netflix with me. And one thing that they've helped me understand is that as a queer person, we are told very early on what spaces you are able to thrive in. Beauty is often one of those spaces. There are just a lot of spaces that you can be directed to. And I love hairdressing, and I love beauty, and I love what I get to do on Queer Eye. And the salon industry, the beauty industry, from some of my earliest times, were my first passions. And because of those passions, I was able to build this career and be where I am today. So I am eternally grateful to that. But also, I think that queer people who are feminine and who are flamboyant, as I've been called my entire life, are not also allowed to be information gatherers, are also not allowed to be seen as credible. And being a comedian or gregarious or flamboyant or feminine, why can't that be mutually exclusive with smart and a talented storyteller and capable of research and capable of disseminating information or being a journalist adjacent, as I like to say? Because obviously I didn't go to journalism school. I didn't graduate college, but that doesn't mean that I can't learn and share my experiences with others.
You mentioned that you got a lot of positive feedback, obviously, for Over the Top. And it's also in this collection where you write about the lives that you touched, maybe of younger queer children who are growing up in places similar to Quincy, Illinois, and were feeling shame that is a shame that is universal to all of us. But with this book, has the mission changed? Are you still trying to reach people to inspire them in the same way? Or sometimes it feels like this book was actually written for someone who disagrees with you. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think those are both interesting takes. Becoming this public figure and having this idea of who I am and what that means to people who love me, to people who don't know who I am, to people who know who I am and really don't like it. I'm trying to learn the balance of staying true to my art and staying true to where I am and not doing it for people's validation and doing it because this is where I am and this is what I am learning and this is an honest representation of where I am in my life. Oh my gosh, I almost got emotional. I am going to get emotional. I just want to look back on this in 50 years and be proud of what, because it's not easy to put yourself out there in these ways and especially in the way that our media and social media works. It's like people are so quick to denigrate you and, for lack of a better word, like shit on you for trying. And I do want to try. And I want to look back on this in 50 years, like I said, and be really proud of the work that I've done and where I am, and that I was brave enough to share these stories. And I do hope that they impact people. But I think that what I've learned, and this is kind of what I say in that first chapter and what's to come, is that relationship that you have with yourself and those around you has to be the key. It can't be the reaction. It can't be the accolades. It can't be the seeking of validation. It is about the art. It is about the connection. It's about the comedy. It's about the writing. It's about the stories that we're telling on Queer Eye, the stories that I'm telling on Getting Curious. I'm really trying to do my best with these opportunities that I've been given and stay true to that art form and my relationship to that art form and where I am in my life. Because it's not every day that someone like me gets to do what I get to do. And I want to make way for new people like me to get to do these things too. But I think that part of that magic is, how do you stay true to yourself and not bend for what you think people want? And that's really scary as an artist, because obviously you want people to like you, but that can't be the reason.
Your words have affected so many lives, including mine. And I'm just so thrilled to be able to talk to you today.
Thank you for having me.
Hopefully we get to do something like this again.
And also the book really is funny, Queens. There is love, there is light, there is laughs.
I can confirm.
It is true. So it is.
I can confirm.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you so much. Thank you.
I'm joined now by my colleagues Jumana Khatib and Dave Kim to talk about what we've been reading these days. Hey, everybody.
Hey, John. Hey, Dave.
Hi.
Shumana, let's start with you. What have you been up to?
Oh my gosh. Well, one of the things that I have been reading lately is a recent-ish book by Leila Slimani, who's a French-Moroccan writer. And Slimani is known for some of her earlier books. One was about a murderous nanny. Another was about a nymphomaniac. And now she's writing a story loosely based on her family history. So maybe the most unsettling topic yet. So she goes back and starts with the story of a French woman who falls in love with a Moroccan who was serving in the French army. She goes back to the Moroccan farmland to build a life there, and it's really difficult for everybody. I think Slimani drew on her grandmother's journals and writings and all sorts of things. So it's a loosely autobiographical novel. I'm learning a ton about post-World War II Morocco, and it's been really enjoyable.
So this is fictionalized, but we know from her, and is there an author's note in the book about how it draws on real life?
Yeah. And I mean, the names have been changed. And she also gave a lot of interviews and talked pretty openly about this. And it's the first in a planned trilogy. So that's always a kind of a funny thing where you really are strapping in for 50, 60 years of something happening. So in it for the long game.
I know that The Nanny is obviously a very provocative book. Does this feel a lot different from that because the subject matter is so different?
It does. It really does. I don't want to say that there's an element of shock value that drives The Nanny. And then I think Adele is the English translation of the other one about the woman who's driven by her desires, I guess we'll say. And those are really outward facing books in terms of, oh my God, the horror. This woman killed her charges. Oh my God, this woman is just having meaningless encounters with men. And it does sort of put the reader in its difficult position where it's like you don't get a ton of interiority into the characters themselves. But this is very different. And you could say that she's looking a little more inward into her family and doing some more imaginative work in terms of what their own emotional life might feel like. So it's a very different register, and it's been very enjoyable so far.
How amazing would it be to just look at your grandmother's diaries? I would just, my God, that would be amazing. There was a period where I was talking to my own grandmother and trying to get her to document her own personal history. And we didn't get very far before she started to have dementia. So it's one of the things I mourn. I wish there was some sort of record of the amazing things she went through. But
I don't have a lot of that in my family either.
Yeah.
Dave, what about you? What have you been reading these days?
I'm reading Phenotypes by Paulo Scott. It's a Brazilian novel translated by Daniel Hahn. It's about race and affirmative action and personal/family history as well. The narrator is a light-skinned Black man, middle-aged, who has worked his whole career really trying to undo racist legacies in Brazil. And he's currently part of a committee of academics and researchers trying to design software that would objectively determine race via algorithm, specifically to see whether a university applicant is sufficiently Black, brown, or indigenous enough to qualify for admissions quotas. A bit of background: in Brazil, public and private universities reserve various percentages of their admitted classes for underrepresented groups. And they've done so since the early aughts. And in the US, of course, affirmative action is common policy, but one thing is for sure, right, is that racial quotas are anathema. We acknowledge there should be some effort to send more underrepresented groups to college, but we hate putting a percentage figure on it. And in fact, the Supreme Court has explicitly banned it. But in Brazil, quotas are just kind of how it's done. So back to the story, the narrator in this committee, they're trying very hard to create this objective technological solution to a very subjective issue. And meanwhile, violent student protests are happening around the country, and the pressure's on for them to come up with something viable. So all this sounds very theoretical, but the novel is actually really intensely personal. The narrator himself comes from a working class background. He's light enough to pass for white and has had a successful academic career in the capital. But his brother is dark skinned and has stayed at home in Porto Alegre. And pretty soon the narrator's past and his family come back to haunt him. As he's doing this committee work, he's summoned back home because his niece has just been arrested at one of these student protests. And she's been found with a gun, which is a big deal in Brazil. And it's not just any gun, but it's a gun that was used to murder someone many years ago. And the perpetrator was a friend of the narrator who had asked him to hide it for him after the killing. And so broadly speaking, it's a book about ideals and theories that are bumping into the harsh realities of the world, and about a past coming back to haunt a guy who's really just trying to undo inequalities that have affected his own family.
Is it a new book, Dave?
It's a newly translated book. I don't know exactly when it was published in Brazil, but it just came out in January.
That sounds great.
Yeah. John, what are you reading?
I'll be brief because I'm about 40 pages into a new book, and it's by an author who I discussed a few weeks ago on the podcast, Gerald Murnane, who's an Australian writer who is quite a quirky character himself. And I'll use this opportunity to, again, this will be the last time I do it, but I can't praise this profile enough that ran in the Times Magazine a few years ago by Mark Benelli, who himself is a novelist and a nonfiction writer, but just a fantastic look at this guy. And I said that I started in a weird way by reading his memoir about horse racing, which is called Something for the Pain. And I finished that a few weeks ago. I think that that's the book most people probably either skip or go to almost last. And now I'm trying to go back and I'm trying to this year get through all of his work. So I'm reading his first novel, which is called Tamarisk Row. And it was published in 1974. It's a very interesting companion to the horse racing memoir because it's about a young kid in the late 1940s, I believe, in Australia who sort of lives his life imaginatively through made-up horse races. And Murnane talks a lot in the memoir about having done that himself, and he has all these files of these imaginary results and things. It's really quite astonishing. But this is more a sort of story about the kid and his dad and the family, and it's going to, I think, open out a bit into more of a family story and probably hews pretty closely to Murnane's life. I think he even wrote an essay where he talked about the fact that, I'm deeply paraphrasing, but something like he wishes he had been brave enough to have all of his editors just publish all of his work as sort of extended essays rather than calling them novels. Although this doesn't have that feel. I mean, this does have a somewhat conventional feel of a novel. It's broken into little pieces with little subtitles, so that's a bit different. But, you feel that kind of from a high altitude narrator telling you things. And so far, I'm really enjoying it. My father was a big horse racing fan, and so I don't have his appetite for it, but I inherited an interest in it. And so I'm sort of drawn to the fairly small shelf of literary horse racing books. So I'm glad to be adding this to the list.
Murnane actually does get his wish in the end, John, because his last book is called Last Letter to a Reader, and it's sort of liner notes to all of his books. It's coming out this year, and there's mini essays about each one of his novels. And he sort of looks back and talks a bit about what inspired them and what he was trying to do. And it's just a great thing, I think, for fans to look back on his career and see what he has to say.
Oh, that'll be very useful to me as I make my way through the books.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about again what we read this week.
So I'm reading In the Country of Others by Leila Slimani, translated by Sam Taylor.
I'm reading Phenotypes by Paulo Scott, translated by Daniel Hahn.
And I'm reading Tamarisk Row by Gerald Murnane. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.